Ah, Jeff, what would we do without you? God only knows what internet horror would be like without those beautiful, smoky eyes and award-winning smile. Your menacing yet theatric demeanor that scared many that crossed your path. The many killers curated in the world of creepypastas that were built based on your stature. There are only a few figures that I deem worthy as being a go-to mascot for creepypastas, and even if you don't shine as brightly as some of your contemporaries, it's honestly a close call. I am very proud of how far you've come and how wide your influence has been for over a decade. And it shouldn't come as a surprise how so many people recognize your importance. So, hats off to you, old buddy. But oh, brother, this story stinks! Okay, maybe that was a little harsh. I don't mean to sound like a dick, but you have to admit that the original story is just not it. Now, sure, you could make the argument that it might not be my cup of tea, since I have built up higher expectations when it comes to creepypastas and the written language as a whole, but I'm very confident that even the die-hard fans of Jeff the Killer would admit that the story has some pretty big flaws to it. A lot of the time, the dialogue and events that play out make the setting feel less like a horror and more like a crappy anime. If you were to imagine those weird MySpace guys that unironically bump to Broken Side, mix in some theatercore cliches, and then let it soak in a vat of serial killer Wattpad, you'd pretty much get this. It's honestly kind of a miracle that it was enough to become extremely popular back in its heyday and built up an entire mythos of characters and side stories. And also, it has built up a sizable fan base over the years and undoubtedly plays a role in shaping internet horror as a whole, for better or for worse. And it's this influential factor on its own where I feel like is enough to look past its flaws, even if there are some sectors from the Jeff the Killer universe that are really bad. Like, really bad. Like, really, really bad. Now, one common motif I've been seeing is people recreating or reinterpreting the original story, but tweaking a lot of the rough edges in order for it to blossom and have a more spooky kick to it. However, not to be blunt or anything, but I feel like things could be pushed further into more uncharted territories. And that's where this video comes in. A couple months ago, I was staying up super late editing a video and playing a crappy horror movie in the background when I had an idea pop in my head about doing a reinterpretation of Jeff the Killer, more specifically focusing less on the story itself and more about how it fits into the bigger picture of internet horror and people's response to it. It's something I've been thinking about time and time again, and even though the idea is very bare bones and leaves a lot of room for growth, I want to use this opportunity to pitch this idea to anyone who's curious. Now, before I get into it, there are a couple things that I want to get off my chest before I begin. First off, don't expect me to go over all the lore and mythos over the Jeff the Killer universe or the origins of the story itself. Like, if you really want to know all the backstory and intricacies of Jeff the Killer, I recommend checking out other videos. Second, I'm going to be making a lot of radical changes to the source material, some of which might confuse or concern more reserved individuals. So I strongly recommend going into this with an open mind and just hear out what I have to say before sending an angry comment down below. I believe that something like Jeff the Killer has enough open ends to warrant changes and reinterpretations, even if at first glance they may seem odd. And with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Here is my unorthodox retelling of Jeff the Killer. first thing I need to get off my chest, if I haven't mentioned it prior, is that I don't want to focus too much on the original story, mainly because it's been tried and true at this point, and instead, I want to build something else entirely that happens to revolve around the events of the original story. Two characters that already exist in the Jeff the Killer universe that I would want to make the main characters instead of Jeff are Jane the Killer and Mary Vaughn. For a bit of backstory, Jane the Killer was a character that was created as an antagonist to Jeff, who's usually portrayed as a vigilante or anti-hero. At first glance, she appears to basically act as a Mary Sue in a tragic vigilante revenge plotline. You know, nothing all too special. However, I feel like there's something deeper about her place in the mythos that speaks volumes to me. I feel like she acts as a symbol for sticking up for yourself and others and going against evil. And even though I have a lot of gripes with Mary Sue's, because I feel like they can come off as being very clunky and give little room for character growth, I could still completely see the appeal in her. Because the idea of being in Jane's shoes, being able to have a ton of power and skills at your disposal, living a life of luxury, and being paid by the government to hunt down criminals, all while taking care of what's left of your family and being in a cute lesbian relationship, it sounds like Jane's living the dream. And even though I'm not a woman, I can still see why many people connected with her and, dare I say, idolized her. But in this particular setting, I want things to be more down to earth. In my reinterpretation, I would want her to start off as conducting her own investigation, looking into killings and crimes involving Jeff, mainly through online sources, but then soon turning to more physical, violent measures. This is something that interests me more because it allows more to build and grow off of than your typical Mary Sue. And it's this setting that I feel like allows for some flaws to be reflected in her character that makes things feel more three-dimensional. And that's where Mary comes in. Mary could act as a missing half that helps balance the relationship between her and Jane. Whereas Jane is portrayed as someone who can come across as overly ambitious and at points a sporadic person, Mary can be seen as more calm and supportive. Basically a voice of reason and strategy, which counteracts Jane's voice of action and emotion. It's a dynamic that's been used time and time again across different mediums and stories, and it just simply works if you play your cards right. So now that we've established our leads, it's time we get into the actual plot. If I were to give a brief plot synopsis, it would be something like this. We follow Jane and Mary as they begin to look into the recent murders created by Jeff the Killer, an unidentified serial killer who's built an online reputation steeped in myth. Think in a similar vein to Jack the Ripper. And as the two go deeper into this rabbit hole, the online popularity of Jeff increases, resulting in a series of copycat crimes growing more rampant across town. As a result, Jane resorts to more physical means, which causes her to grow an online cult of her own, which fills her up with even more determination than ever to bring Jeff down. Now, if I were to be more specific on how the events would play out, I think the best way to start things off would be to have Jane read out the original Jeff the Killer story, specifically the intro where Jeff breaks into a random person's house and they give a report on it, and have that situation play out in her head. And we see that there's something about the mere idea of Jeff alone, something that shakes Jane to the bone, which prompts her to look into more online reports or stories about Jeff, thus setting off the series of events that'll occur once she begins conducting her own investigation on the murders. Now, this can make Jane out as someone a little over her head, but still means well deep down, even if she comes off as intense at times. And there can also be some added conflict when she tries to juggle around her investigation and family life, be it taking care of her sister Jessie or maintaining her relationship with Mary. It shows that even with Jane's obsession with looking into the murders and gathering information online, she still has some responsibilities outside of the internet. And this is something that Mary's concerned about, though she's still willing to help Jane out in any way that she can. At first, Jane does a lot of sleuthing purely online, refusing to get off the internet, losing some sleep. You know the gist. Soon enough, with the help of Mary, Jane turns to the outside and starts gathering some more information about Jeff and the murders, such as going to the library or asking the locals around. The stakes are suddenly ramped up when killings start to become more prevalent around town, which prompts Jane to double down on tracking down Jeff. One day, she sees someone dressed up as Jeff planning on robbing a home. She intervenes and tackles him to the ground, only to find out that this person isn't the real Jeff, but someone doing a sort of copycat crime inspired by Jeff. And this brings up the question, are the killings being conducted by Jeff or by others impersonating him? And this is how I make my reinterpretation less about the traditional story of Jeff the Killer, but more of a commentary on the mythos and impact of Jeff. If you really look at the grander scheme of the Jeff the Killer universe, a lot of the stories revolving around Jeff at the time read very similarly to fanfic or coming from people who it feels like empathize with him too much. If my memory is correct, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the Jeff spin-offs that followed the original were either over-the-top edge fests at best and questionable romantic shippings at worst. In my interpretation, I find the idea of copycat murders to be crucial. It shakes things up enough to where it presents what could be an interesting critique about fan culture, but also makes sense in looking at Jeff in the grander scheme of his influence, how people reacted, or how people look back on him. Because in this particular setting, what if Jeff was treated in a similar way to how people obsess over Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer? And what if people decided to take things to the next level? And what if that got out of control? So at a turning point in the story, Jane lays witness to a woman getting stabbed, which causes her to charge at the criminal and engage in a brawl. Jane ends triumphant, saving the woman, but in doing so ends up killing the criminal and flees the scene. Now, in response to this incident, she begins to grow a cult following of her own. However, she decides to take advantage of this and starts documenting her vigilante whereabouts online for all to see. She then goes on living a double life, being an unassuming individual in the day, but at certain nights adopting her killer persona. And the situation only goes crazier when even more altercations start growing rampant around town, conducted by followers of Jeff and Jane alike. But even with things spiraling out of control further and further, Jane is still experiencing quite the high, much to the dismay of the people who care about her the most. Now, we're going to pause here because this setup could work on its own with Jane investigating the murders and the online reputation of Jeff before turning to the darkness. However, what if I were to add even more onto it? How could we take this plot synopsis even further, or at the very least make sure there's enough material to make things feel even more fleshed out? Well, I'm going to start jumping the shark on this one, but something that popped into my head is potentially encoding narratives from other creepypastas outside of the Jeff mythos, but are still somewhat similar or inspired by the original texts. There's a comment I read a while back on one of my videos that mentioned how it would be interesting if there was an anthology show that covered a wide array of creepypastas and even alluded to these different creepypastas existing in the same world. And that person was kinda onto something. And that's something that I would like to explore in this particular interpretation. Quick side note, I'm sure that there's at least one person out there thinking, well, how can you title something Jeff the Killer when there's more focus placed on other creepypastas? Well, I would make the argument that a lot of iconic creepypastas you see nowadays exist because of Jeff. Now, I mentioned the idea of copycat murders earlier, but I also feel like it would be interesting if there were a good chunk of other crimes or murders that directly reference the stories that happen to be in a similar footprint to Jeff. Now, I've handpicked a few that I think would work well with the story I pitched earlier, with their common theme being around different killers or criminals of some kind, and draw some similar ideas from Jeff, however small or insignificant they might be. As I feel like this similar theme would allow the aura and atmosphere of Jeff to maintain its hold. Like, think similar to Goblet of Fire, where it only features said item in a few scenes, but is significant considering how the events and conflicts that follow are in some way a direct result from it. Now, throughout this story, specifically near the beginning before Jane resorts to physical matters, we could see Jane and Mary talk with or befriend various people with different backgrounds that directly reference other creepypastas outside of the typical Jeff mythos. And as the events progress, we see these characters go through their own downward spirals or have their own conflicts arise that drive everyone up a wall. I will now read from a list I made referencing other creepypastas and how they could potentially translate into this grander narrative. Eyeless Jack, where we see a kid named Mitch who gets his kidney stolen by a guy in a blue mask. Laughing Jack, where it's this weirdly dressed stalker who drugs a family, kills the kid in a very sick and gruesome fashion, and frames the mother. Funny Mouth, where we see a man named Greg get cyber-stalked by someone and has his shit hacked, and on top of that, one day wakes up to find his jaw dislocated. Teeth.jpg, where two artists are trying to find their missing friend after finding weird photos online, only to find her horrifically mutilated. Liars, where an edgelord pushes people too far and suffers through acid burns and killing the people who threw the acid on his face. And Ticky Toby, in which a kid named Toby who has tics, who finds solace and escapism through the internet, and eventually sets his neighborhood on fire. And by the way, keep an eye out for the last one because I'm going to get back to Ticky Toby in a bit. So with those examples out of the way, again, the goal of a lot of these interactions is to not only integrate a different creepypasta to this world, but also add to the narrative of Jane herself. Not only through presenting different challenges to her character, but also by further enforcing her mental spiral through the actions of those around her. And considering the amount of potential story tie-ins that I mentioned before, as well as others that I know I'm forgetting, there can be a lot of ways to have these story threads bounce off one another and contribute to something more complex in the long run. However, even with all its ambition and potential, all good things must come to an end eventually. And if there was any way I could conclude things, it would go as follows. In the midst of the chaos, Jane would eventually confirm that Jeff did have a brother who survived the night of the first killing, where Jeff murdered his parents, and she and Mary track him down. This is where they are introduced to Lou, and we get a reveal into what really happened with Jeff that tragic night. Lou is another pre-existing character in the Jeff mythos that, despite coming across as another sort of fanfic-esque manifestation, there are still parts of him that I find to be very interesting that could be expanded upon. Despite being the brother to a psychopathic murderer, Lou finds pity in Jeff, mainly because he sees some humanity in him after being spared the night Jeff killed their parents. If my memory serves me right, he was often seen as being fairly docile, only lashing out at others who dared speak badly of his brother. Something that can be drawn from the source material is Lou's complex feelings towards Jeff, where he's protective of his brother's memory, blocking out any negatives, and once it becomes too great to ignore, he just loses composure. So Lou has a conversation with Jane and Mary in which he explains the events that played out the night Jeff killed his parents. He explains how he and Jeff moved to a neighborhood and got in a fight with the local kids, which made Jeff feel strange and powerful. When a cop came to question the family and started targeting Jeff, Lou panicked and attempted to use a knife against the officer, which resulted in him being sent to juvie. Months later, after Lou is released, he learns that Jeff got horrifically burned and goes to see him. And while Jeff looks drastically different than what he remembered, and while he does have concern for Jeff's sanity, Lou still cares for Jeff and is just glad he's still alive. One night, he wakes up in the middle of the night to his parents screaming and loud noises. When he exits his room, it's a horror show. The furniture is destroyed, bullet holes and scratches are riddled all over the walls, and blood and guts are scattered everywhere. Lou notices Jeff amongst his dead parents, his face now mutilated beyond repair, his eyelids burned, and knife marks carved into the sides of his face, shaping a crude smile. Jeff is about to attack Lou with a knife, but stops after hearing Lou plead for his life. Jeff then tosses the knife aside and presses a pillow against Lou. And as Lou passes out, he hears Jeff beg him to go to sleep. A while later, Lou wakes up and is saved by law enforcement, but is placed in foster care. At one point, after a report of Jeff breaking into someone's home, Lou runs away and tries to find Jeff, still believing that the brother he loved is still out there. Unfortunately for him, Jeff is dead. He finds the rotting remains of his body in an alleyway a couple blocks away from their home. Lou then hides his body in the trash in the alleyway and walks away. A couple years later, he sees that people online have started to make fictionalized, more over-the-top stories based on the murder. This causes Lou to smile, as he sees this as people finding something good or entertaining out of the worst traits of his brother. Now, when Lou retells this story, it's important that things are painted in a much more harsh or unforgiving light. It should act as a stark contrast between the Jeff portrayed in the online space as an unstoppable killer that's often fantasized over in weird ways, and the Jeff in real life who was a burn victim who resorted to self-mutilation, brutally murdered his parents, broke into someone's house days later, and then died shortly afterwards alone in a dirty alley. Like, it's so much more brutal and even sad. And even if the murder is portrayed in a way that focuses more on creating a spectacle, at the end of the day, it's something that's incredibly dark and scary in real life. So after Lou gives his side of the story, Jane feels cheated and insists that there has to be something deeper considering the increase in murders around town as a result. Lou retorts, claiming that things have always been terrible around town and Jeff was simply the straw that broke the camel's back, and even so, it's not Jeff to blame, but the people. How it was the people who built up the image and chose to act on impulse, and how no one really has control of how others would perceive a story in the first place. But then Lou also states that Jane has no right speaking about danger and her concerns over death, considering that she herself is part of the problem. This revelation hits Jane like a stack of bricks and has her questioning everything. Because even though Lou's head may not be in the right place since he's still defensive over Jeff even after all this time, he's technically not wrong. Because at this point in the story, Jane did build up a similar following online, as well as committed at least one murder up to this point. But even so, she can't just sit by and wait until the killings just blow over. For her, something needs to be done, and if it requires fighting fire with fire, then so be it. In the end, I want there to be a bit of a gray area with Jane and Lou on their own rationale of the chaos, but still carry some truth through their words that get people thinking. Jane and Lou's battle of wits are suddenly interrupted when they catch news of a fire spreading across town, specifically near their neighborhood. The two rush away in order to save Jane's sister, Jessie, and other bystanders and neighbors from the fire. They arrive just in time, and Jessie and a few others are saved before the fire department arrives. Jane sees the dressed-up perpetrator in the distance running towards the woods. She chases after him and eventually catches up to him and pins him to the ground, and sees that the fire was started by a young teenager named Toby. Yes, that Toby. If I were to go off on another quick tangent, Toby can act as a representation of creepypasta obsession gone wrong. The original story of Tiki Toby is, again, pretty ridiculous, but takes on an interesting light if you view it at a certain angle. This might seem far-fetching, but sometimes when I think back to Tiki Toby, I'm also reminded of the Slender Man stabbing in Wisconsin. And while both these things are wildly different from one another, I feel like, in a way, they revolve around the idea of proxies, like the action of representing or appeasing something through horrible means. Now, this is not to take away from the real-life stabbing, which was absolutely horrific beyond any fictional story, but it begs the question on how far the obsession over scary stories or myths, especially through the eyes of the youth, can go before shit hits the fan. Now, in my personal opinion, there was a time when creepypastas entered a very edgy phase and often blurred the lines between fact and fiction for a lot of young kids, but in the end, it's just a form of expression and storytelling. And looking at how things have grown over the years, those same kids, myself included, have grown up and looked back on the past and made out what's set in stone from a more mature lens. That's because even if some people fold under the terrifying nature of these stories, even if they haven't aged all too well, for the most part, we just continue on with our day. We engage, we grow upon the foundation. It all comes down on whether it brings out the best in us or the worst in us. And looking at how the fandom has grown over the years and how chill and oddly wholesome it's gotten, I'd say it's headed in the right direction. Okay, I'm getting off track here. Back to the story, Toby pleads with Jane to have mercy, crying about how he doesn't want to die and how he has a deep regret over what he's done. After hearing him beg and weep, Jane spares him and guides him out of the forest, right into the arms of the police to deal with him. Jane, Mary, and Jessie, all completely worn out, decide to gather what they can and move to another town. They then settle in a shabby apartment, back to square one, but not before making some new acquaintances and connections with other survivors. They've been through hell, but they still have hope that things will work out for them and that people will eventually come to their senses. And that's where it ends. Or does it? Honestly, looking back on what I've written, traversing through this odyssey of words I've constructed, I don't think I want a story like this to die right away. I've only given a basic outline on this reinterpretation I constructed, and I still feel like there's just so much more to comb through in this world I made. I hate to say it, but I never thought that I'd get so attached to my own creation. So let's just say that even though there's an end, it doesn't really mean it's the end. And on that note, I feel like this is a good time to end the video. I feel like it's gone on for long enough. If you made it this far in the video, first off, thank you so much. I went through a lot putting this together, and I'm glad it's finally over with. If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing as well as liking and commenting on the video. Also, make sure to check out the Discord and become a member where you can see some behind-the-scenes content as well as some potential events thrown by yours truly. Thanks again. My name is Valentino, and I am out of here. Bye!